showing us their strength and their resilience. And I applaud um, their fortitude to get on the front line. I think the main thing that is driving our young people to get on the front line and to protest and to raise their voices is that they see themselves in so many national victims. You know, how many young people have gone to the store to get Skittles and an iced tea? You know, they see themselves in Trayvon Martin. They see themselves in Tamir Rice. Young people have little brothers and little sisters that play with their toy guns and water guns. So they see themselves. And, you know, our beloved Freddie Gray here in Baltimore City, who, what do you think they feel when they know that Freddie Gray made eye contact with a police officer and was chased down and lost his life? They see themselves. The tragedies that we see in this country is a reflection in their own lives, and it is moving them to stand up and raise their voices. And I'm amazed by it. I feel I get goosebumps when I see young people walking through the streets and protesting and holding up their signs.
Hi, my name is Young Elder. I'm 18 years old. I'm a youth leader, a part of Heart Smiles, and today I will be performing a song that I wrote called I'm Trying. Get out. 6'2" with a hoodie, he a black male. Police searching through the hood. Only time will tell. When they find him, they gon' kill him. They ain't doing no talking at me. He about to lose his life just for jaywalking. But that ain't it. He got a son and a daughter. They about to grow up alone. No, they won't have no father. Fast forward a couple years, son trapping every night, getting money for his mama, trying to keep on the lights. No, he ain't had no father figure, had nobody there to guide him. Loyal to the streets, and he keep the Glock beside him. Nobody there to teach him that some friends are snakes. He just wanted fast money Elder. You can follow me on Instagram at young.elder_. Thank you so much. Love y'all.
So good afternoon. Before I begin, I would like to encourage you to type your questions and comments on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, or Instagram, or text your questions to 22333 and type JHMI in the message. I'll be taking questions later in our session. Today's Road to Equity Symposium, Addressing Health Equity and Achieving Restorative Justice, focuses on improving social justice and the health of our communities, particularly the nation's most marginalized residents. My name is Michelle Spencer. I am a faculty member at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, and it is my honor to serve as your moderator. This session builds on the previous conversations we had in late August that focused on the judicial system and supporting our youth. I want to acknowledge the pain and the inequities that is occurring across our country. We are at a critical moment, and protecting the lives of our youth is paramount. This segment started, as you just heard, with a powerful statement from Young Elder. In her performance, one of the very first lines, listen, one of her very first lines, and I quote, she said, I'm trying, right? And if you were listening and really paying attention, you would hear that another line, she said, how am I doing? I'm not doing well, because statistically, I'm supposed to be dead or in jail. Okay, I wanna repeat that just one more time for you, in case you missed it. How am I doing? I'm not doing well, because statistically, I'm supposed to be dead or in jail. So, thank you for joining our panel discussion on protecting our youth, confronting society's role in the harmonious development of adolescence. This segment really, in theory, bookends what you have heard from previous panels today. You heard about the path, where should we begin, invest, and go? You heard about restoration, repairing harm, finding balance, building hope. Well, now, protection. I submit to you that resourced, deprived communities face unequal burdens of economic, social, and health disparities. I share with you that there's a conceptual model that includes the individual, the family, the school, the community, and the policy structures that need to be in place. So today we'll talk a little bit about the framework and what protective factors are needed to support our youth, given what Young Elder just shared, and given the prevalence of adverse childhood experiences in resource-strapped communities, particularly Black and Brown communities. The young adults in these communities face the unequal burdens of incarceration, economics, injury, and death. What is needed, as you will hear, is protection, right? Protection for our youth. What protections, however, are needed to ensure that our young adults thrive? What protections are needed to be in place that allows the conceptual framework to apply also to our Black and Brown people, our Black and Brown young adults? What protections are needed to be in place that allows us to commit to the security of their spaces, their voices, their bodies, and their lives? So today I am joined not just by you, but by this esteemed panel that includes the Honorable Judge Martin Welch, who retired in 2014 after more than 21 years of distinguished judicial service. I'm joined by Professor Vanya Jones, Associate Professor in the Department of Behavioral Health, Behavior, and Society at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. I'm joined by Ms. Nancy K. Blackwell, child welfare professional with over 20 years of experience in human services with social and public policy organizations. And I'm joined finally by Dr. Brian Sims, Associate Professor of African Media Psychology and Education Psychology at Florida AME University. And so to begin this conversation, my first question I will pose to Professor Jones and Ms. Blackwell. Our youth today are facing so many issues like gun violence, bullying, and mental health. What areas of adolescent development should we really focus on improving first? And I get it. There's education, there's youth justice systems, there's housing. But I'm asking you first, Professor Jones, followed by you, Ms. Blackwell. What areas of adolescent development should we be focusing on improving first?
Thank you, Michelle, for that fabulous introduction. And I got to echo Young Elder and her performance and how powerful it was, in her words of, people are crying, parents are crying for the loss of their children and for the experiences that their families are having. That's a pretty heavy question to start with, and I'm going to do my best to answer. I think there's two things that we really need to focus on, and I'm going to spend a little bit of the time that I have been talking here with everyone in highlighting these two areas. The first is parents. There, in our last conversation, we didn't spend a lot of time talking to those who are fundamentally charged with the very hard job of raising children. And when we talk about Black parents in particular, I think of the work that I've done in schools and how Black parents are asked to help their children navigate a system that also treated them poorly. So when they come in as parents to advocate for their children, they also have to deal with the trauma of experience that they had and being told that they were inadequate and that they received harsher judgment. So I think the first thing we need to think about is how do we support parents in those systems that we know touch our young people so they are equipped to address what we know are historic injustices, that they too have to address the trauma in order to advocate for their young people. The second thing that I'm going to talk about as we go on and try and uplift really stems from, sort of the great line of Frederick Douglass of it's easier to build strong children than repair broken men. So this idea of where do we go and how do we handle adolescence, or where should we start to help our adolescents, is really thinking about what is it that helps them become productive members of society. We need to let them, I'm going to speak particularly to Black children, Black adolescents. We need to let them take the risk that white adolescents get to take and not have the same the harsh punishments that they get when they make mistakes. So we know adolescence is a time of taking risks. I said this in the last session that we had. It is what we mark adolescence by. I'm glad I didn't grow up in adolescence during the social media phase. But I think about the young people who are and the harsh judgment that they get for making what are truly adolescent mistakes. So I want to protect our young people. So in adolescence, they can take the risks that they need to take safely in order to become adults and make sound decisions. Ms. Blackwell, I'm going to turn it over to you because I might start, saying more.
Thank you, Vanya. I would also just echo 100% of what Dr. Jones just shared. I would also add that we need to really support fragile families. Oftentimes in this area of work, we don't want to talk about the challenges of poverty or the challenges of fragile families. And, everything starts at home. And we really have to support families, whether it is access to mental health care, improving families' access to educational resources in and outside of the school, creating safe spaces for families that are in need, and also attempting to separate when a family comes for help. How can we make sure that those families are helped and their kids are not um, seen as being neglected? So let me give you a quick example. There was a situation in Baltimore a few years ago where Baltimore was given a license to operate a 24-hour casino. And there was a young woman who went to a job fair and she was given a job on the spot at the job fair to work at the casino like 2 days later. This woman did not have a chance to secure daycare and everything that goes along with getting a job. So she had her child in her car at the casino while she worked. Someone saw a child in a car and called the police. The mother had come out of the casino taking breaks throughout the day to make sure her kid had food and snacks and things. And yes, she did put her child in danger. However, we have this huge 24-hour operating business and no childcare. And this woman did not have time to access childcare. figure out plans. So all of those things. Thankfully, she did have a car with insurance, and she was savvy enough and smart enough to come to a job fair and get hired right on the spot. We've got to figure out ways to assist fragile families so that they can support their children. The other thing that I would also add is that we also have to support organizations that have positive track records. That support families and not leave organizations starving on the vine, who are really at the community level doing the work, bringing families along.
So thank you, Vanya, and thank you, Miss Blackwell. One of the things I love the fact that you raised the issues of family and family connectivity to social services and supports that they need. I want to ask Professor Sims, Black youth are talked about differently than white youth when it comes to juvenile justice. And Dr. Jones said that in one of her opening or second statement, right? Like she wants the adolescents to be able to take risks. That's part of their trajectory. That's part of how they grow. But she also wants those risks to be equal and same as when white young adults take those risks. So here's my question for you. Why is it, or what does it mean to criminalize our Black youth? In what very simplest ways and terms would you say why it is important for us to be clear about what we say and the way we talk about our Black youth? And why are Black youth framed so differently than white youth? And I know, right? I'm going to keep adding to this question. Why is it, to Vanya's point, are Black and brown young adults not able to take those risks in the same way? And I would love, I know, Judge Welch, I want you to jump in, but I think I want you to answer a slightly similar question. But Professor Sims, to you, please help me.
Yeah, it's a good question, and the always eloquent Vanya Jones, I think, set it off exactly right. Vanya, I'm gonna see your Frederick Douglass quote, and I'm gonna raise you Dr. Wade Nobles, who's run Black Family Center out in the Bay Area for decades and decades. Dr. Nobles says, "Power is the ability to define reality and to make others accept your definition as their own." So Michelle, when you asked the question about like why is the current status quo so intent on criminalizing Black children, it's because that's what the United States of America has always done to African people. Since we got here, we've been seen as nefarious, as threats, as problems that need to be solved. And so I think you're really just sort of seeing an extension of that. And Dr. Noble's quote about reality, for me, really speaks to the media. And it's not like an apology to point to the media to say this is what's going on. But I think we need to start sending very clear messages as we support our parents, which is your children are not the problem. Your kid, if he gets in trouble at school, trust your kid. Your kid, if he gets in trouble with law enforcement, trust your kid, because until we start to actually be serious about those familial connections of love and harmony, then we'll always be doubting each other, and we won't have the basic fundamentals of trust that people outside of our communities have.
So Judge Welch, jump in here. From a legal standpoint, how do young people address the justice system? How do they engage in the justice system? You just heard Professor Sims say that this is a system that has been set up this way from the moment we got here. So what do? We can look at that as an opportunity for us to think, wow, we're always going to be in a deficit position. Help us understand.
Well, part of the problem is the justice system itself, or the juvenile justice system, and I sort of talk about that, or we should think about that, not only in terms of juvenile justice, but also the adult system that deals with issues of child support, and the criminal justice system seem to be in three separate silos. And there's such a disconnect when we talk about providing services to families and children who truly need it. And then you lay onto that the perception starting in education, with police, through the juvenile justice system, how children, Black and brown children, are viewed differently, treated differently, and primarily because the lack of resources and access to resources that is so chronically overburdened and wrong that a very deep hole. One of the thoughts where, what comes first, the chicken or the egg? Do we fix the juvenile justice system or do we fix the education system? And I think it's really got to start very early on, really in utero, with providing appropriate services so that child has a chance to make it through. The system's not going to change quick enough, but to be able to raise children that are able to navigate the system. It's really more about pathfinding.
I think what you've just said in terms of it starts in utero goes back to exactly what Dr. Jones said earlier, and also Ms. Blackwell, about supporting, being able to support the family, right? All of the different dynamics and intersections of family support. So I'm going to bring Ms. Blackwell back into this conversation. When we talk about youth, their experiences are deep and their experiences are varied. How are these issues and challenges magnified within the LGBTQI youth and their experiences and their trajectory into adulthood? And can you talk a little bit about some of the services that we should be considering for the LGBTQI youth, and as well as homeless youth as well? These are issues that you raised in our last panel earlier this summer.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, we really want to focus on Black and Brown children, but I think there are some staggering statistics when it comes to the LGBTQ community, especially the Black and Brown community. I wanted to pull up some numbers before we got on today, and the suicide rate within the LGBT community is 41%, and that's 25 times higher than the general population. So the fact that, LGBTQ youth often deal with isolation and bullying and homelessness and, lack of support and not feeling a part of families, not feeling a part of their greater community. Um, the data is really staggering. 1 in 4 LGBTQ youth consider suicide. It also goes back to our last conversation when we talked about guns in homes and gun violence, and often guns equate suicide in our community, which is really scary. Um, the other thing that I would also talk about is just the fact that LGBTQ youth are also suffering higher levels of homelessness than other youth. And the limited amounts of services for this population also makes them fragile. So there's a couple places in the city that I think I will highlight. There's Chase Brexton, which is a medical facility that provides lots of community-based services for LGBTQ youth. J Pride, Joy Baltimore, a few other providers of services. Also within high schools, because um, because we want to have safe spaces for our LGBTQ youth. Lots of high schools now have safe spaces or guidance counselors who have a safe space triangle to let LGBTQ youth know that this is a safe space for them to come and gain support.
One of the things as you were talking and you said the suicide rate among LGBTQI youth is 41%. The thing that came to mind, and I know the answer to this question, is do youth within the LGBTQI community feel seen? Do they feel seen? Do they feel heard? And then, Professor Sims, I want to ask you the same question. Do Black and Brown youth feel that they're even seen, that they have a space and a voice in community? And so, first, Ms. Blackwell, please, to you.
Yeah, I think that's part of the challenge, and I think that's often what pushes some of our LGBTQ youth to the brink of suicide, is that they don't feel seen, they don't feel heard, and there are not lots of safe spaces, whether those safe spaces are within their own families or within the larger community. I mean, we all have driven on Charles Street and we see the painting on the ground, Black Trans Lives Matter, which is very, it when I drive over those words, I feel, I feel the spirit of that community screaming out, we're here, acknowledge us. Our pain is real, our joy is real, and we have to celebrate all aspects of our community.
Professor Sims.
Agreed. Nothing else really to say there. We have to begin to find material ways to celebrate every corner, nook, and cranny of our community. I mean, for African people, the singular most successful strategy in what Chancellor Williams referred to as the destruction of Black civilization is separate. cause fragmentation, division, and antagonism between those who should see ourselves as brothers and sisters and folks armed in struggle. So I think you said it all, Ms. Blackwell.
So thank you for that. Professor Jones, youth, as you just heard, right, are in pain and are experiencing trauma. So what types of programs and services are provided in schools and in the community that can help young people deal with their experiences?
So I am going to echo a little bit of what Dr. Sims just said. It's bringing people together that have shared experience, and go back to my original statement of how are these systems engaging the whole family. Ms. Blackwell mentioned the fragile sort of family are extremely help support. I'm going to point them out when it comes to systems like schools, and how in schools, research tells us all the time, school engagement by parents increases positive outcomes for young people throughout the spectrum of their life. So if you are engaged in a young person's academic performance, if you go to PTA meetings, if you are checking their homework, young people tend to do well. But my original statement was, how do we add that burden to Black parents who have been treated poorly in those education systems? So the first thing, one of the first programs is considering what are those school engagement programs to truly address the historic injustice that Black families have faced when it comes to engaging the educational system in America. So some schools have tried to do things like school community coordinators. Some schools have tried to do, the burden is on the system to appropriately engage families in order to make sure the disservice that has been done is addressed. So that's my first point. The second, we talked at length about police in schools in our last meeting. I'm not going to bring that up other than to remind you all of the comment that I made earlier whenever I'm told about how school resource officers or police are seen as like mentors and coaches, and they can have a conversation. I always respond, why don't we have mentors and coaches? Why are we introducing the criminal justice system into our school system? So schools are a great place, to engage young people, extracurricular activities, sports, building their interests. They're great. But if we're going to spend time including the criminal justice system in their educational experiences, what in fact are we telling young people, especially Black children, who are disproportionately impacted by that experience in their educational pursuits as they grow up? So what I would like to see happen is that we spend a little bit of time proliferating those things around coaches and mentors and building those positive experiences for young people. I'm also going to one-up Dr. Sims because now he's brought the quote. So one of my favorite Americans is Fannie Lou Hamer, and she reminds us, when I liberate myself, I liberate others. If you don't speak out, ain't nobody gonna speak out for you. So we're at the stage where we have some ability to speak out, speak out.
So Dr. Jones, thank you for that. And so I am going to turn it over to Judge Welch. And so Dr. Jones said, when we have the space, we speak out, and we should speak out. She also said that the burden is on the system. So here's my question to you. What are the questions or requests that communities should be asking of their elected officials in order to use and gain the momentum for the social justice movement, specifically as it relates to our youth?
I think it has to do with equity. How do we get the systems? And maybe it's equity and funding and services, but I think more importantly, we talked about a disjointed system. How do you get the educational system to deal with the juvenile justice system, to deal with the social services system, to deal with the child support system? And until we get those silos separated and everybody focusing those services on one family and that family's overall needs. So I think to the extent that there's something that we should advocate for, it's that.
And as you said, equity within those systems, it goes right back to like my opening remarks about this conceptual framework and how this framework works, but not necessarily in communities of color and what is needed there. So I'm going to jump back to Dr. Sims, and I'm going to ask you that, or state to you that there are numerous studies that suggest that Black youth are more often criminalized. and that they face challenges with being viewed more harshly by society. What are the practical steps that we can take now to empower them? How can school systems, much like Judge Welch just mentioned and Dr. Jones and Ms. Blackwell, how can school systems, maybe community groups and other stakeholders engage young people in positive ways?
Yeah, another great question. There's a West African proverb that says, where there are two wise men that agree, there's no need for one of them. And so
Mm,
I'm going to very, very respectfully disagree with the Honorable Judge Welch on that point around equity, only from the standpoint that equity has never, ever, ever been shown to work for African people. Black folks in America have never gotten close to an equity position. And so for me, I'm much more in favor of terms like self-determination and liberation. Like, how do we free ourselves from these this apparatus that has continued to plague us? And so while I think the equity conversation is a good start, I don't think it's where ultimately we need to be. I mean, Tupac Shakur said it, right? I ain't guilty. Because even though I sell rocks, it feels good putting money in your mailbox.
mhm.
So we think about like what it means to criminalize. It's the people that have been forced on the bottom that have had to do what any person in their right mind, what any rational, sane individual would do in their own self-interest to survive, and then been called criminals for it. So I don't see equity as a possibility. I'm in favor of models. And to Nancy's point earlier, there are lots of living models around the country right now that are trying to give power to Black and brown people in community spaces to move beyond how do we match up or meet the standard or guidelines that the system has set for us into a space of how do we make decisions about our own lives? How do we take economics in practical ways and solve the problems of feeding our children?
So, Dr. Sims, how do you do that, right? You say self determination. Like, there's the economic structure that may not support the self determination in the structure and system that currently exist, and
Right.
the structure that we as people of color live under. So, how do we do that?
Yeah, so a good question I have for folks who've made all kinds of sacrifices and built careers around answering that question from a professional standpoint is where, from a historical standpoint, where are we in relation to the Kerner report? I mean, that question was the question you just posed, Michelle, was answered 50 years ago in 1968. The Kerner Commission report clearly said the poverty and institutional racism drive the problems in what we call the Black community. So solving problems in terms of like what Black people's behaviors or attitudes or assumptions or values are without addressing those fundamental issues, I don't see as intellectually honest. So that's what I would. I know that's not an answer. That's an academic answer, but that's what I would.
But I appreciate that. So, Nancy, I want to go to you because you noted that there are lessons that can be learned and gleaned from other countries, right, around the world. So, what are
Hmm.
some of those lessons?
So the one thing that I would note is that not here in Baltimore, here in the U.S., we are feeling the challenge and the push to really elevate issues of racial justice, social justice, equity, and inclusion. But it is not limited to the U.S. Everyone around the world is also feeling it. It's very interesting. I have been invited to speak at the Global Summit of Children in Foster Care, and this is an international event. And one of the topics that I have been invited to address is around racial equity of children in foster care in other countries. Here in the U.S., I'll be representing, what's happening in the U.S., but I'm on a panel with folks from the UK, New Zealand, and Peru, and they are all dealing with challenges of Black and Brown children being overrepresented in their foster care systems and also in their juvenile justice systems. And everyone is at a point of we have to address these issues. We have to fix the systems so that we can stop repeating mistakes of the past and build equitable systems for all races, but also figure out a way to improve what we've already done, the harm that we've already done to Black and Brown children. So I think, as self-centered as we often are here in the United States, I think it's important for everyone to know that
Mm.
everyone is feeling a push to improve the lives of Black and Brown people around the world.
So, Thank you for that. Here's a question that came in from the chat because I realized I wasn't checking it and I'm just going on with like the things that are coming to mind. So here's one from the chat. How do communities remove the stigma of assistance to fragile families to get them the services they could benefit from? And so maybe I'll ask you, Dr. Jones, to talk about that. I think you raised that very early.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I'm gonna discuss it from the perspective of schools and some of the work that I've seen happen in schools. Change how you engage all families. So stigma is an issue because you've decided this is a group that's special and needs something extra, as opposed to how are you in fact engaging families in general to help support every child and family in the way they need to be helped when it comes to supporting them. So I think the first thing we do is when you do things like, I've had some discussions around, for example, follow me with a story really quick, some discussions around why can't you have social workers, engage with families in ways that help provide these services? And I respond with, I want you to go talk to families who've had experiences with school social workers, and you tell me how that experience went for them and why that's a problem. Because we've decided helping support families that need additional help is extra and special, as opposed to how we should be thinking about developing that relationship with all families. Does that help?
I appreciate that, Dr. Jones. So, Judge Welch, here's another question from the chat. What does the lack of Black teachers at the early education stages impact, or how does the lack of Black teachers at the early education stages impact the overall perspectives?
Well, my mother was a teacher and come from a long line of teachers, and I realized how important it was. I'm the oldest person on this panel. I went to a segregated school, elementary school, and all my teachers looked like me. And so if you play that out as to the importance of having people that look like you at very early stages of your life, as well as throughout your life, that they're police officers, they're judges, they're social workers, they're others that people can otherwise relate to. And I'm in no way taking away from those teachers and other professionals who don't look like me, but just knowing that there's something more than what you might see day to day in your own community of different options for you as you grow up. I think it's extremely important.
So Professor Sims, thank you for that, Judge Welch. Professor Sims, I feel like what Judge Welch just said echoes what you shared earlier, right? And so can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, he couldn't be more right. So it's important not just that Black children see themselves, affirm themselves in the teachers that are guiding them at an early age, but also the cultural values and the structure of what goes on. I mean, one of the assumptions of early childhood education in the West that I feel like has never ever even been mentioned, much less challenged, is parents' ability to effectively choose their kids' teachers. Every year in August, parents send their kids away to school, and maybe you know who the teacher is, but at no point do you have a relationship with that individual, much less have the intentionality of choosing who's going to spend that kind of quality time with your kid. That alone, so in our work at Jomoworks, connecting universities with K through 12, that's big. Just enabling school districts, middle school counselors, high school principals to say, you know what, maybe parents should be driving this process in terms of what we can do with our teaching resources. Because something as simple as what Judge Welch mentioned with his mother being an educator, right? He mentioned his mother as an educator, but you know what? All mothers are teachers, and most teachers do some mothering. So these are African principles that we've known for forever, but that have not ever been taken seriously in the West, that I think would make a real material difference.
Yes. So thank you for that. Here's another question that comes from the chat. What role does and can the faith-based community play in bridging and developing relationships between law enforcement and young people? I'm going to turn that over to you, Nancy.
Thank you. I would say that the faith based community is one of the pillars in our community. And when you think of public agencies, when you think of the business community, I would say the third pillar is the faith community when it comes to providing support and social services on a daily basis to our families, to individuals, to schools. They've always been a pillar. And there's lots of opportunities for the faith community to step in. There's infrastructure in our faith community. Many church buildings have daycare centers. Many church buildings have after school programs, mentoring programs. They're often a safe space for our young people and our families in need, whether it's a food pantry or if someone needs help with their gas and electric bill. I mean, our faith institutions are a bedrock in our community, and I think they're already fully engaged. And if you are a person that belongs to the faith community and you're watching this, encourage your place of worship to engage. If there is, a nice mold-free basement in your church, do some programming there. I think it's lots of opportunities for us to reach beyond our doors and really engage with the community.
So here's another question that comes in. Thank you for that, Nancy. Here's another question that comes in from the chat, and I'm going to direct this to you, Dr. Jones. At what point do we address the PTSD that many Black and Brown youth experience as part of their daily living?
Yeah, I think that is a really important question, and one that is where we should be directing some resources when it comes to all of those programs and services that I talked about earlier. When we talk about school, when we talk about coaching, when we talk about mentoring, how are we in fact allowing young people to process all of the things that are going on in their community and that they see happening to their community? Those are hard things to grow up in ordinarily. They're even harder when you're carrying the burden of generations and the struggles that the people who came for you had. So I think the first thing that we really need to do is spend a little time. My grandmother used to say, call a thing. Spend a little time calling a thing and realizing that where we are for young Black children has been built over generations. And we need to spend some time as a country, if we really want to make a difference, tearing down some of those systems and silos that have put us in this place. So I think the first thing that we need to do is spend some time investing money into those spaces for communities that have experienced things like redlining. School funding comes from your tax base. If you have a poor tax base, what do you expect your schools to look like?
So here's one of the things, and I appreciate that, Vanya, because I think you started off talking, and we all started off talking about this trauma, right? Experiencing communities of color. And so let me just ask, what if you had to give advice for our young people and those who work with our young people, what would that advice be? I'm going to start with Professor Sims.
I'd start with dialogue. You got to find ways to actually have a two-way engagement with another human being. So at the point where what your lessons or your information or your wisdom becomes purely prescriptive, that's when kids start tuning out. And I think you'd be surprised. One of the lessons I've learned in X number of years as an educator myself is the real magic happens when you as an educator learn something new that you didn't already know. You walk into a classroom and you walk out with something that you didn't walk in there with. So I think kids are in their brilliance. They have the ability to sense and tell those individuals that do that versus those individuals that don't. And if you're in the other category, if you're in the wrong category, you will get written off. So if you're serious about any kind of youth development, this is a lesson I learned from Regina Jackson out at the East Oakland Youth Development Center. Like, if you're serious about kids, you got to listen. Before you say a word, you've got to understand. And so I think that's a tip that I usually kind of try to start with.
Judge Welch.
Again, two wise men. I think Professor Sims is the wisest. I know for me, having worked with children for many, many years, it really is that connection. And it's whether it's eyes, it's what you say, it's how you look, it's the empathy. And I've run into very few kids out of the thousands I've probably come across over many, many years that you could not make that connection. It's hard work sometimes, but you're the adult.
Yeah.
You're the one who has that responsibility. And when you get feedback, when it works, it's one of the most fulfilling things as a judge for me to be able to make that connection and maybe have some influence on how that case or that child might end up.
Nancy?
I would say the biggest lesson that I've learned over the years of working with children and advocating on behalf of young people is that their voice and their life lived experience and their life experience really matter in how we develop programming, how we make policy, the recommendations that we make, whether they're recommendations to federal funding, state funding. It's really important that we honor the voices and the lived experiences of the young people that we're advocating for. So, when you're creating a program, make sure that you engage some young people to see what would work best for them. Young people may not want a program from 9 a.m. until 2 p.m. because they're asleep. They may want a program from 2 p.m. until 7 p.m. because that's when they are awake. So I think just making sure that we engage with young people to listen to what it is that they want and how it is that they would like programs to be built for them.
Professor Jones?
So I've been wearing it across my chest the entire time. I'm gonna
Yeah.
take a moment to acknowledge that last night was a historic moment. But we had a Black woman on stage as a major political party trying to help lead this country. But she was not the first. And I am reminded of Shirley Chisholm. And the words that she echoes: if they don't give you a seat at the table, bring a folding chair. And I think this goes to what Nancy said earlier in that quote, which is what makes me so excited for the future, is seeing these young people show up and demand that they be seen and that they be heard. As we think about what's happening in our country and we think about next, we know there's a lot of issues. We know we have to move forward in a lot of ways. But the way our system's set up in order to fund things, in order to provide community programs and services, and to answer that question of how do you take the stigma out of helping families, you have to move those resources in ways that help those families. Please show up and vote, make a plan, get out there, do your part.
And thank you, Dr. Jones, on that point. I want to say, when you said the folding chair, I just want to share with you that many times, right, like, we are invited to the table, either for our visible presence or for our number or whatever the case may be. But I think the question that is always in the back of my head: I've been invited to the table, but am I welcomed at the table? And I think it goes back to what Dr. Sims said, what do we do when we don't necessarily feel that there are spaces or places for us to have that voice? We may be invited, but what happens, right? What happens when we get to that table and we try to articulate exactly the concerns and the historic issues that we have faced, and what happens when we are trying to advocate in the educational system for our young people, because we ourselves have been in that system. I think that we have 1 minute left, and I want to ask, I think 54 seconds, quite frankly. I'm going to ask all of you, starting with Nancy, what would you say to young elder? What would you say to young elder when she said, I'm trying? What would you say? 40 seconds left.
I would tell her to show up and show up with her sign, show up with her message, and bring, if she's not invited to the table, bring a seat, because her message is so strong and her voice is so valuable.
Thank you, Judge Welch.
I would tell young elder that we are resilient. She is resilient. Progeny of all who've come before, and we're going to ride her coattails.
All right, Professor Jones.
So I'm going to echo what Judge Welch said, because I know my mother would be thrilled. I know I said no shout outs, but would be thrilled because she adores Judge Welch. That she stands on the shoulders of people who came before and worked hard, and she is a part of that stock. Keep moving.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Jones. Professor Sims.
Same, young elder, there are a nation of youth just like you in Queensbridge, in Atlanta, Georgia, Durham, North Carolina. So we appreciate that perspective and that love.
And I appreciate all of you. I would say that When young elder asks in another space, how am I doing, right? That our responses need to be indicative of the policies and the infrastructures that we have created that supports young elder and the many young elders, right? That supports their physical, social, educational, judicial, economic development. And as you all said, in the way of the resiliency of our youth, of our Black and Brown youth. And so I hope that you all that are viewing will applaud, will help to applaud me and thank our panelists for the excellent presentations, for their thoughts, for the way that they're helping us understand what our role is in supporting young adults, Black and Brown young adults in communities all across this country and certainly here in Baltimore. So to you, Ms. Blackwell, to you, Judge Welch, Professor Jones, Dr. Sims, thank you so much for your time, your energies. And I know that I'm going to get kicked out. And so let me ask those of you who are watching, we want to learn from you. And so before we break for this intermission, here are two questions. What was something you learned or can take away from this panel? What is the one thing this experience is inspiring you to do? Please type your responses to 22333 and type JHMI in the message. Please take a moment to respond to these questions as we take a 10-minute break, and we will be back at 4 p.m. with our keynote address from Dr. Andre Perry, and I think focusing on the economics of it all and where do we go from here. So thank you again for joining us. Thank you again to my dynamic panel and all that they have shared this afternoon. And young elder, be encouraged. We are standing on your shoulders and riding your coattail, as Judge Welch noted. Thank you.